present everyone. Okay. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, apologies for this delay. The audiovisual stuff seems to be having quite some problems in this room. I spoke with the tech staff about it, and they're supposedly looking into it, but it keeps on biting us, and I apologize for that. In this final week of the course, we're going to be working together to explore a set of topics in addition to having a review of the course. And there's two final topics that I wanted to cover here. These are topics which are at the frontiers of modeling. They are topics which raise great prospects for use of the methods covered in this class. And they're topics around which research is rapidly advancing. The two topics will in turn look at different aspects of collecting information from the world and making sense of it through a modeling lens, okay? A lens of dynamic modeling. But they'll be taking a look at different aspects of that. On the one hand, we'll be looking today at ways of taking data in to a model on an ongoing basis in a way that helps the model learn from externally observed data and become more savvy over time, become more accurate in its depiction of the current situation in the world, more accurate in its estimates of certain parameters, etc. So that's a set of techniques. What we're going to be looking at Thursday will actually also be about looking at data as it comes in, but it will be on the theme instead of taking that data and using it to directly gain an understanding of the underlying real-world processes that give rise to it. Not just the processes as captured by a model we built, but more broadly, what sort of processes are giving rise to this data? What can we know about them? What's driving what within this real-world system? Which variable is causally affecting another variable? And it turns out the approaches that we've outlined in this class, and particularly this notion of state space, gives us the key tools that we need to do this effectively. Now, I've named this lecture "Moving Beyond Myth and Madness" because of a comment that a scientist once commented that theory without data is myth, and data without theory is madness. And really, the theme of this week is going to be bringing together theory in the form of models with data to make sense of patterns we see at the world. We see in the world. Somehow looks like I'm giving the wrong title slide. Okay, well, it would be appropriate for this slide as well. But the particular subtitle we're going to use today is particle filtering. What, why, and a bit of the how. This lecture is going to draw heavily on material that you would have been exposed to in courses in probability theory, in potentially courses in statistics within this institution. And it's going to push you a bit on that side as well as on the dynamic modeling side, okay? In order to motivate this approach, I'm going to be posing to you two metaphors that are germane to modeling, that challenge our assumptions about how modeling should work. They pose real-world challenges, and drawing on how we solve those sort of challenges in other areas, they point to opportunities for our dynamic models, our simulation models, regardless of whether they're agent-based models, system dynamics models, or discrete event models. I'm then going to go into to briefly talk about this technique of particle filtering, which is a technique for drawing together real-world data as it comes in with a dynamic model. So it brings these pieces of the puzzle together, evidence from the world, and a model which tries to depict features in the world that might give rise to that data. And we're going to take a brief glimpse at looking at how it works, going a little bit lighter there, and focus more on some points of learning and conclusions. So the two problems, the two circumstances I'd like you to think about is there's many circumstances in the world. I'll talk about one in just a moment, circumstances involving medical imaging, where often we have multiple lines of quantitative evidence that relate to different pieces of a system. So we might have data, for example, about births and about deaths and number of people who go to the hospital to report illness within a system. In other cases, we might have different data, different sort of images that come from pointing X-ray machine at one angle or another angle through our body. And this gives different images from different angles. Here, in both cases, these data exist at various levels of reliability. A given X-ray image may have a lot of occlusion, a lot of blockage of certain features of the image. It may not depict certain parts of the body. The data from the world might only depict small pieces of the system. It's not depicting how many people there are there who are infected but not yet infectious, don't yet have symptoms, for example, or how many people are recovered. But we're interested in taking these different data sources and using them to create a consistent picture of what's going on. What's the bigger picture, fusing them into a single understanding of what's happening. And with dynamic models, we're further interested in understanding how the system is likely to evolve over time and how, if we undertake interventions in the system, they're likely to evolve things. So for something like influenza, we might have reported cases from an emergency room, from labs that have diagnosed cases within the population based on family physicians or based on emergency room requests from particular cases. But we might also have, for example, information from Google about how many people are searching for terms related to influenza, or how many mentions there are on Twitter related to influenza. People chattering, saying, you know, my sister's down with the flu today, or I've got to stay home, my kids are sick with the flu. There's a lot of chatter on there. Think about Facebook and people's status updates on Facebook. An awful lot of information out there besides neatly classified health system reports that could point us towards some understanding of, you know, how many people out there might be sick with influenza. We might also know something about the number of people being vaccinated. Similar for health condition after health condition. We often have, you know, small bits of understanding of the system, and we want an understanding of the broader system. Now, in other contexts, in medical imaging contexts, if you go and you break a bone, or you might have a hairline fracture in your spine from an automobile accident or what have you, chances are you'll undergo some sort of what's called imaging. They'll put you in a CAT scan machine, for example, and they send X-rays through your body at various angles. Those produce multiple images, and they take all those images and they produce a 3D picture of your body. Same thing with MRI, magnetic resonance imaging. So to extend that to dynamic modeling, what we're trying to do in much of this talk is outline a method that uses a model to kind of depict the broader system, and then informs that model in kind of the same way you'd inform a 3D image of a body. you inform it with multiple lines of evidence, just like you'd reconstruct a 3D understanding of where things are, what things are, what places in the body, where the cracks are, and so on, using many images. We'll do this with this model and bring together many lines of evidence that can be fused into one model. Now, that's sort of one point of understanding here. But I'm going to present another one as well. With dynamic models, such as we've been working in this class, the tradition for many decades has been to build the model. On the one hand, we conceptualize it, we formulate it, we parameterize it, we calibrate it, we conduct sensitivity analyses with it, validate it against data, and otherwise test it. And once we're confident about it, once it matches data pretty well and it seems to accord with understanding, we then use it for insight. We run scenarios with it. We use it to ask what-if questions, etc. The problem with so it's a great approach, and it's been used very successfully in many decades in many different spheres. The problem is that when we have a model like this, if we want to incorporate new understanding into it, new data from the world, it turns out it's a heavyweight process. It involves recalibrating it in a way that you're pursuing for your problem set, but it's a fairly manual process. It's a fairly a process that requires attention and study. And calibration gets us somewhere, but it turns out it has limitations. Limitations on what we can do with a single set of values that's best for the parameters as compared to a distribution of values, for example. We have difficulties in many cases using it to understand how many people there are in different states of the system right now in an effective way. Now, the challenge here is particularly acute when we're responding to things where knowledge is not great. For example, we work with a number of partners around Canada to formulate ways of responding to infectious disease outbreaks. So when an outbreak of measles occurs in Alberta, or when an outbreak of influenza occurs here in Saskatoon, there's parties who will come to us and often ask questions about where's this likely to go? What can we expect? Are the number of cases still to rise? So using all the data that we've gotten thus far, they'd like some clarity on what lies ahead. The problem is that, particularly when we're dealing with a new type of infection, something like SARS. You folks are too young to remember SARS, but back in 2003, I was doing consulting in Singapore, and we were handed out masks on the plane flying over to Singapore. It's a 17-hour journey from Los Angeles at the time. We were handed out masks by the flight attendants along with the drinks and so on. And people wore their masks through the flight. I tell you, you get to know the taste of the mask pretty well. SARS scared a lot of people because it would pop up and infect a bunch of people in an area. They'd quarantine, a given zone, close it off to the outside so people couldn't come and leave, and try to get the infection under control. It popped up not just in its home country in China, but also in Singapore, and also here in Canada, in Toronto. The problem is that when we have outbreaks like that, new infectious diseases, a new strain of flu, they say the strain of flu this year, I happen to know because we work with colleagues in Australia a lot in this area, and they were very hard hit, and we're expecting to be hard hit this year because because of some aspects of its molecular characteristics. It evades a lot of the vaccinations that are given. And when we're dealing with something like that, it's hard to build a model that's got all the evidence in place, because often the evidence doesn't exist yet. And while we can spend a lot of time building a model, often by the time we finish it, it's too late to inform the decision making. So we have this awkward choice. Either create a very detailed model that isn't available in time, or we create a very rough model that gets us going, but it's increasingly disconnected from the actual situation because we had broad uncertainties, and each new week that comes in, it shows that the model is getting further and further off when running from its baseline point as to what should be going on now. And the truth is, all models are approximations. George Box, the famous statistician, said, all models are wrong, some are useful. All models are approximations. They approximate, they simplify things in the world. That's where they're useful. But in so doing, it is inevitable that if we try to compare them and their projections over time from a given point with what's going on in the world, they're going to diverge. They're going to differ. They're going to become more and more apart, very likely. Why? Well, the model omits some factors. It has approximations in it. It didn't consider certain factors which tend to have a big influence, people's change in attitudes or what have you. It also has factors related to stochastics, which, look, I mean, aspects of weather, there's no realistic way we're going to anticipate that in the model, that it's going to be, there's going to be a few storms which prevent people from getting into the emergency room and allows the flu to spread more or what have you. Stochastics, even if we had them represented in the model, we don't know which way they'll turn out. If they'll turn out one way or turn out another way, because they're random. Now, the way in which we deal with this in the world, however, is surprisingly robust. In our day-to-day work in the world, we have ways of dealing with these inadequacies of our models. Because, ladies and gentlemen, in something that I will emphasize again on Thursday night during our review session, all of us are modelers at some level. Those people out there who've never taken this class and never will, especially after hearing my lectures. Those people are all modelers. The models that they carry around are models in their heads. We all carry around some guesstimates as to how the world works in certain regards, how the prof will react to an extension request, how hard the exam will be, how to pace ourselves in the exam. These are all practical questions, and we carry around models in our heads that are often highly imperfect, that will allow us to navigate. And I would add that every one of you coming here this morning, coming here this afternoon, was using a model. You were using a model in your head about how to get to the U of S. Some of you came via bus, some via walking, some biking, what have you. Some drove in. But you had to use a model of some sort to get here. That model may have been very detailed. You were aware there's that possibility of a train crossing Preston Avenue at certain times. You want to avoid that. Or it may have been more coarse-grained. You hop on this bus and some number of minutes later will plop you in front of Place Riel. But the fact of the matter is, you didn't just rely on that model when getting in this morning or this afternoon. Instead, you were on an ongoing basis coming in using your eyes and potentially other senses to sense exactly where you are, where you need to get off the bus, where you are in terms of navigating within the U of S to get to this room. So in short, we depend on mental models, but we're always getting input to those models. We're always taking input from observations about the world and meshing them with our models to update where we are. Just like if you have a GPS in your vehicle, you have a sense of where you are, but you're having this GPS sort of recalculate. It gives you an updated sense of where you are. We're always checking as we're driving where we are. Is our car in the middle of the road? Is it off to the left, off to the right? And we're correcting. If we had to navigate in every day to work and back with our eyes shut, we wouldn't live very long, right? We'd run into cars. We'd run into buses. We'd be crossing the sidewalk when the light's not the right color. We'd be hit by a bus in Place Real area, what have you. The problem is we'd be dealing with a growing inaccuracy in our sense of position if we tried to navigate our way home without new input. Our model will be increasingly diverging from the world. That sounds familiar. Our mental model now will be increasingly diverging from the world. The first few steps out of this room, you'd probably be okay. You might end up at the bottom of the stairwell because you didn't judge correctly the number of steps. You have a good mental model of that stairwell, but it isn't quite good enough to allow you to avoid certain mistakes. The fact is, from our navigation of the world day to day, ladies and gentlemen, it points to an underlying truth, which is that for many circumstances, models are great. Models are essential. If you didn't have a model how to get home, you'd be in a hopeless situation as well. But to be effective, to be efficient, it needs to be joined with observations on an ongoing basis. You need to take that model and cross-check it with an observation. You could do pretty well getting home if you were to open your eyes, I would say, every 30 seconds. Be sort of walking in a certain direction towards Place Real, you'd open your eye and go, okay, I've got to correct a little bit. You close your eyes for 30 more seconds, you open them, okay, I'm outside the doors there, now I've got to open the doors. Even occasional input can be good enough. But the question that I want to pose to you, the challenge is, why do we base our planning and projection, our use of models, historically on blind simulation models? Why are we taking these models, which may be finely crafted, like surely the models in your projects are, and why do we use them without ongoing input to guide them, to inform them, to ground them? Why are we asking our models to do what we never consider doing with our mental models, which is navigating open loop, navigating without new input? Or, to turn it on its head, how can we make our simulation models more like our mental models in the sense that they can be flexibly updated with new data as it comes in? That if we can get that little bit of update as data comes in about where we're at, we can do a better job planning. Just like the GPS system in your car, it will give you a route to your destination, but then if it realizes you're at a location that requires rethinking of it, like you've gone past the intersection where it suggested you change, it will say recalculating, and it will tell you, okay, go this new way, right? We'd like a model to be similarly intelligent. Models are imperfect. Maybe the data coming in can help correct them all. Maybe it can help ground it and correct its expectations so that we're always looking forward with more and more sureness about where we're at right now. And it can give updated recommendations, much as the GPS system gives us updated recommendations about where we're at. So the vision here, the vision that's achieved in a very notable way by the techniques that I'm going to be providing a glimpse of today, is a vision of quickly formulated and frequently regrounded dynamic models. Models that can be pulled together quickly using skills such as you've been developing in this class, and that as new data comes in, it can automatically inform the model in a way that doesn't require running a long calibration process and adjusting parameters, etc. It's automatically regrounded with new model. Okay. And the idea here is that we're going to trust the model some, we'll trust the data some, but each is very imperfect, but we'll get a synthesis of them that will keep the model current with the latest evidence while recognizing that that evidence is fallible. It's incomplete, it's imperfect itself. So this fundamental idea is not entirely a new one. it's a very new one when it comes to application of these sort of simulation models. But in other areas where similar techniques are used, it's well established. So if you fly in a commercial jetliner, or you consider the rockets that are used to launch satellites or to reach the International Space Station, all of them have this sort of mechanism in it. They have computers which will calculate where are we likely based on the thrust of the engines and the measured wind speed, etc. They're guessing where we are now, and then they'll take GPS readings, which tell us roughly where we are with some error around that. And they'll merge them together to get a consensus estimate, probably where we are. Where are we? And use that to project forward, okay, the thrust has to be increased in that way or that way. And it'll take another measurement, 15 seconds later or something. Where are we? Combine it with an understanding of where we thought we'd be and come up with a consensus. The data from the GPS is imperfect. It's got some big ranges of uncertainty that may obtain. And the data from the approximation from the model about where we're at is imperfect, but together they're synthesized to be a far better estimate. Okay, so let's talk about particle filtering. I noted the vision here. Quickly formulated, get pulled together fast enough to ask urgent questions. Frequently regrounded models that have these observations and are sort of updated with their understanding of the current situation on an ongoing basis. Okay, that's the vision here. One way to accomplish this is through this general technique called filtering. This is a technique that's been around at some level, at a very pronounced level, since the 1950s. And it's called filtering for historic reasons. We're seeking to inform, to sort of lower the error associated with our estimates using data that's coming in. And there's two popular filtering methods that are around. Most rockets, planes, missiles, and so on, they tend to use a thing called a Kalman filter. There, we actually may be applying it many times a second. We're updating our estimate about where we are. Sometimes we have telemetry that will give us an estimate of where we are many times, very, very frequently, and we'll use something like the Kalman filter. But the other technique, which we'll be focusing on today, is particle filtering. And particle filtering is a much better fit for our needs. It's more general. It doesn't require assuming a model that can be directly linearized. So for example, we can do it with an agent-based model or a discrete event model. It doesn't have to be a model that can be where it can take the Jacobian to calculate sort of the rates of change around a certain point in state space. And it has very flexible assumptions about sort of the nature of the noise involved. Kalman filtering needs to make very strong assumptions about the nature of the process, but dynamic modeling in its various forms is a much better fit to particle filtering for more relaxed distributional assumptions. So what is particle filtering really doing? Well, it's allowing us to balance the noisy data that's noisy, that has errors in it, with model predictions and come up with this consensus estimates that's greater than the sum of the parts. It's better than either one. You might think there's an easy misunderstanding that comes in when you have multiple data sources. That if you have multiple data sources and one of them is greater accuracy than the others, you should just prefer that one. Far from the case, ladies and gentlemen. It can be shown statistically that you can actually do much better by combining the estimates from them. Even though you might think mixing in the lower quality data sets will hurt you, typically it helps because they have different information in them. And you're getting some information from them, even if it's less than what you're getting from the high quality data sets. This is one of the reasons for the computer revolution associated with the area of bioinformatics. It used to be that biology was dominated by this notion that we can only deal with the very highest quality experiments. Bioinformatics open up the potential to use a wide variety of data sources of very different levels of quality, and use them to inform, in a very meaningful way, understanding. Because they do offer different information. And so it is with our models in these data sources. Okay, so a particle filtered model, like we're going to be talking about, is basically going to allow us to estimate. This is the key thing. A particle filtered model allows us to take external data on an ongoing basis and to use that data to estimate the current state of the system, the value of each state variable, each stock for a system dynamics model, or the number of people with different characteristics in an agent-based model and their relationship with one another. It allows us to estimate the state of the system, locate it in state space. But it doesn't just do that in a naive way. It actually gives us, ladies and gentlemen, a distribution of states, of possible states. These ones are more likely. Those ones are less likely. These ones are possible, but not so likely explanations of this data. In short, it allows us to operate a model. If you think about it very crudely, it's like operating a model not with, think about an SEIR model in system dynamics. You have one number for the number of susceptibles, one number for the number of infectives, one number for the number of exposed, one number for the number of recoveries. And you run it forward. At any one time, there's one number. This, it's like you run it forward and there's a distribution over time. A distribution of different hypotheses. So one hypothesis says, there's a lot of susceptibles, there's few infectives, and there's few exposed individuals and few recoveries. Another hypothesis will be, no, actually, it's only a moderate number of susceptibles, quite a lot of exposed, quite a lot of infectives, and few recoveries. These are different hypotheses that we can entertain. And the ones that are more competitive with the data that explain it better are the ones that will survive in this kind of survival of the fittest. So we can use it to estimate what's going on in the world, taking into account our uncertainty. In fact, we're not certain how many people are out there that are sick, but this is kind of the distribution associated with it. We think it's probably, between 50 and 100, but it could be as high as 250 and as low as 25. Now, once you have a model like this, you can actually project forward in a distribution sense too. So you could say, okay, we're interested in what will happen 2 weeks from now. Number of people sick here in Saskatoon with flu. This is the distribution we get. That it'll be probably between 1,000 and 2,000, etc. Or we could ask what if questions that will allow us to say, well, what if we do this and we'd get back a distribution? So let's consider a case of H1N1, the outbreak of flu, the so-called pandemic flu in 2009, 2010. You folks were younger then. But you were probably aware that there was a bad flu outbreak and it killed a decent number of people, and it got a lot of people very worried because it could have been a lot worse. Like in 1918, where a flu epidemic killed tens of millions of people. So let's consider modeling this situation with a compartmental model, with a system dynamics model. So here we have susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, and vaccinated. And people, by getting sick, by getting exposed and infected, they become exposed. They go through this incubation period where they are not yet infectious, but they've got the virus in their body. And then at some point they become infected. Typically, this is about a 3-day delay. They're in the exposed state for something like 2 to 3 days. and then I get infected, and then I get recovered. So if we have a model like this, we might have a very rough and ready model that we create. And the idea is to use that model to take in data up till now, and this red line vertically indicates where we are now. And this model is sort of taken into account data prior to there using this thing called the particle filter. And based on that data, it projects forward in a distribution as to how many people are sick. And you could see this particular model, which is a very naive model, very crude, doesn't have age distributions associated with it, only very rough sense of how many contacts there are, etc. It has a distribution that's not particularly great at this point. But as time goes on, it learns. It learns from that data. And it comes up with a better estimate as to how many people are likely to get sick in future weeks. Each of these is associated, I believe, with, no, that's actually a day. And using those numbers till now, it projects forward, okay, in the next 2 weeks, you know, how many people will get sick. And here you could see it's pretty well on. As more data comes in, it gets more narrow in its approach. And at some points, it overestimates and realizes, okay, I've overestimated and brings down the estimate here. But it's learned here. Or another example is measles in Saskatchewan here, where we might have data up to this dotted red line. And the model that captures that understanding up to here has recognized how many people are likely susceptible, how many people are likely infected till now based on this data that's come in. And it's realized, wow, there's been a big outbreak. So almost certainly, since the outbreak is very high now, that's drained the number of susceptibles. You could see it kind of, this number of susceptibles here goes down. And so it says, okay, going forward, that's to the right of this dotted red line, it's going to project a falling set of cases associated with this. And it does fall, and it's going to predict a subsequent rebound as the number of susceptibles goes up again, and then a fall again. And then it's increasingly uncertain about what's going to happen after that point, something along these lines. So ladies and gentlemen, as new data comes in, here we have the data coming into about 35. It resolves more and more what's going on, and it projects forward with greater clarity some of these regions that were originally just uncertain, and can give an estimate for the entirety of the time frame eventually. So here we have data up to 75, somewhere around here, and it exactly hits this kind of down sweep there. Here it's not so good. It anticipated a subsequent outbreak, but it's corrected by time 95. So in short, we're operating here, ladies and gentlemen, no longer with a model that is just one estimate for the number of people in each state, but rather it is a distribution. And that's the key thing. It has this distribution. And the distribution reflects all the observations till now. And the distribution gets updated as the model projects forward. So it thinks, okay, there's going to be this many cases at this point, this many cases at the other. And then when new data comes in, it often narrows that distribution for nearby points in time. It makes us more confident. So we're operating, you can think crudely, we're operating this model almost on a distribution. We're running our simulation on a distribution of possibilities, where some of those possibilities are more likely than others. You can think of it as having multiple hypotheses in the model. Some of the hypotheses are there's more people in this state, some have less people, posit less people in this state, and the ones that are more consistent with the data get survive, and the ones that are less consistent get weeded out. Okay, so how does particle filtering work? How does this work? Well, simulation model in this case normally involves a stochastic process. So there's got some uncertainty over time in this model. This model could be an ABM or a discrete event model where we have uncertainties associated with it. Remember, in discrete event modeling, we had uncertainties associated with the delay. Or in models of ABMs, we had uncertainties associated with who sends message to whom, or uncertainties associated with transitions between states. Those are all examples of fine stochastics. In a system dynamics model, the uncertainties might be, we're uncertain as to exactly how many people get sick per week from flu because of small numbers issues, small counts involved. Or it might be, we're uncertain how many contacts people are going to be having per day, and anticipate that that might change. Okay? So the idea here is that the simulation model includes a stochastic process. It includes this uncertainty over time. It doesn't make sense to run this method if there's absolutely no uncertainty over time, for reasons I won't go into, but may hint at later. Now, between observation points, it's going to take each of these hypotheses, between points where there's actual observations from the world, new data coming in. Between those points, it's just going to run each hypothesis forward. So if you, at time 30, think there's these many people in SEIR, your hypothesis, your particle thinks that, and the next observation is at time 40, we'll just run till time 40, that particle, without any change. It'll be like running the model with that particular assumption. By contrast, at observation points, we're going to correct the model expectations. How many people are in different states? Okay. And the ways in which we'll do this is we'll represent this distribution by representing a set of possibilities. And these possibilities are called particles. These represent the different hypotheses about what's going on in the world. And some of them will have higher weights than others. Some of them will have more sort of strength to them as hypotheses. Others will be weaker. They won't be as strong. They won't be as likely. We'll view them as less probable. So there's going to be these particles. And here's the thing, ladies and gentlemen. There's just a few things you carry away from this lecture for later this week. Remember that particles are associated with hypotheses about the world, okay? And a model runs with a bunch of hypotheses over time, and the particles capture those hypotheses. And the particles capture a distribution of possibilities. Possibilities involving how many people there are in each state of the model, for example, okay? Each stock of the model. So we run the model on these many, many samples. A given model we might run on 1,000. If we want to do it really quick, we might run on 100. More typically, we run on 1,000. Maybe we run on 10,000. Okay, at the same time. 10,000 different hypotheses about what's going on there out there in the world. How many people are there in each state? And there are these competing hypotheses. They're competing for viability. And the viability is determined by the data. It's determined by, do they posit things which end up being consistent with what we see from the data? Okay. So here, at any one time, we might have a set of particles in the S state. So I'm drawing out here a SEIR model. And we might have a set of particles, where you have a set of particles, and each particle has in it a full representation, some number, some particular number at that time for S, some particular number for E, some particular number for I, some particular number for R. Each particle has that. Each particle hypothesizes, a certain number for S, E, I, R. And these particles exist in large number, say 10,000 of them at once. And so each of them has conceptually a copy of model state. If this were a normal simulation model, system dynamics model, we ran it. At any one time, there'd be one number for S, one for E, one for I, one for R, right? Be four numbers that would characterize the state of that model at any one time. Here, each particle has four numbers in it. S, E, I, and last but not least R. Okay, so each one is a copy of model state. And each one is also associated with what they call the weight. And the weight kind of gives a sense of the relative probability of this occurring. This is linked, for those who are interested in these things, this is linked in with a statistical method called importance sampling, which is a very important method. And there's neither the time nor in the room the expertise among most students to appreciate exactly why this works. I'm not going to try to do it, but suffice it to say that the weight represents how credible, how believable, how plausible that hypothesis is, given the data that's been seen until now. So each of these particles is associated with SEIR, but it's also associated with a given weight. And the higher the weight is, between 0 and 1, the higher the weight is, the more sure we are, more confident we are that that's a viable hypothesis. That's a strong hypothesis. A weak hypothesis we associate with a weight close to 0. Okay? And these are competing hypotheses. The weights sum up to 1. Just like if we take a distribution over, say, the value of S, if we went and looked at each particle and we were to consider it, we might get a distribution over S. But in this case, the way we do it is we sample them by weight. The ones that have high weights we consider as having more significance when we're considering it. So one that has 3 times as much weight as another would be counted 3 times as significant when totaling up this distribution. So those particles define distributions over S, over E, over I, over R, and in fact jointly between them. So we say, oh, if S is high, then I is low, or S could be low and I could be high, something along those lines. So there's the survival of the fittest, ladies and gentlemen. The particles survive, their weights grow, and they survive a process called resampling. They sort of reproduce, as it were, based on their consistency with the data. So, look, imagine that you have observations on the number of people who are getting really sick with the flu. That would be sort of observations relating to people becoming sick with the flu would relate to this flow between E and I. E is people who are infected but they're not yet sick typically, and I is people, we'll posit, who have symptoms. Okay, they have the sniffles. They can pass on the flu easily. Actually, slightly conflating what's called incubation period, latency period, when the symptoms appear versus when you're transmitting. What's really scary is there's quite a few diseases out there where you don't have symptoms yet, but you transmit. You infect people around you, even though you're not. You don't know you're sick. About that. Measles is one of them. But let's imagine that you develop symptoms in I. This is when people might go in and report to a doctor they're sick, or they might search online for dealing with flu symptoms, dealing with body aches or fevers or what have you for their child, when to take their child into the emergency room, what have you. So we might have data about this point. And we don't have data directly, typically, on SEIR. We might have data on I if it's a really serious disease, if people are in the hospital or something like that. but we generally only have data on little bits of the system. But each of these particles is implying something about the rate of this flow. Each of these particles, because after all, this flow rate is dependent on the number that are in E divided by some tau or something like that, divided by a delta. And if it's a first order delay, it depends on E, and each of the particles posits something about E, so they posit something about this flow. And we could ask, if there's a particle which says, 1,000 people per week should be going, according to its hypothesis of the world, 1,000 people per week should be going into the emergency room, and instead there's 2 per week or 3 per week. That particle is not very competitive. It doesn't have a hypothesis which is very consistent with the empirical data. And that particle will be viewed as less competitive and have a lower weight. By contrast, if there were a particle which posited, around 3 or 4 people per week going into the ER, and there was 2 or 3, we might say, okay, that particle has a pretty competitive understanding of the situation. And then we'll rejudge it a week later, and a week later, or the next day. We keep on judging them. And the particles that give compelling understanding that's consistent with all these data points, will survive through it. And they'll be represented well, and we will trust them more. Okay? So there's the survival of the fittest, and we typically have a fixed number of particles, but the ones that have low weights get weeded out. They get resampled out. The ones that are high weights get reproduced at these after many updates, many observation updates. So here's our model, and over time we have these distributions. Okay. Okay. So the key operations of the particle filter involve updating between observations. Here we're just running the model. So if we have a certain number of people susceptible, exposed, infected, recovered, and vaccinated, we'll just, at time 30, we'll just run it forward to time 40. Boom. So suppose one particle says, there's 993 people susceptible, 2 people exposed. I posit there's 993 susceptible, 2 people exposed, and 5 people infected, but 1 person recovered. That might be that particle's understanding how it hypothesizes the situation in the world. That's what it thinks is going on in the world right now. And that's at time 30. And if the next observation is time 40, that's after the last observation. The next one's at time 40. We'll just run that particle forward, or we'll simulate it forward. Okay, suppose at time 30 you thought this many susceptibles, exposed, infected, recovered. Run it forward according to the normal equations here till time 40. And maybe the number of exposed will be going up, the number of infecteds going up, and the number of susceptibles coming down, and the number of recovered slightly going up. Time 40. Now it's time for the next observation. We do that for every particle in parallel. Okay, all the particles get updated in parallel in this sort of way. Next, at the observation point, we observe something. This is like, ladies and gentlemen, this is like you trying to navigate your way home here, and every 15 seconds you open up your eye and you see where you are. You look around. Oh, okay, that's where I am. Okay, I gotta move slightly to the right to be in line with the door down the staircase, or I've got to move to the right to get through that door to Place Real. So at the observation point, this is where we're taking an observation. We're getting data from the world. We're seeing something in the world. And this is where our understanding of the world is updated, it's corrected. We correct our understanding of the world, and as it's captured to the particles based on these observations. So how do we do that? Well, we update these weights, and then we go through a process where we weed out things with low weights. Okay? Here, we update the weights in a way that judges, okay, the particle will be downweighted, will be given a low weight, much lower weight if its expectation disagrees. If what we expect through the particle disagrees with the empirical data, it gets much lower weight. If it's highly agrees, we get a higher weight. That was the process I talked about earlier. So if we have this given particle that says there should be lots of people getting sick and there's really few, it gets low weight. If there's a particle that says there should be few people getting sick, we'll give it a higher weight. And the same thing, if the data from the world says lots of people are getting sick and there's a particle that predicts something very similar to that, we'll give it a high weight. Okay, so at this observation point, we update the weights, and then if there's too big a disparity in weights, if there's tons of particles with really low weights and just a few with high weights, for example, we basically reproduce the particles with high weights. We reproduce according to the weights. So if there's something with low weights, it has a very low chance of being reproduced. If there's something with a high weight, it has much higher chance of being reproduced many times. And the weights disappear. So we actually copy the particles to the next step with the probability of representing each according to its weight. Okay? So this is the basic idea. These particles capture different hypotheses. The weights represent how plausible those hypotheses are. Between these observations, we just run the model in our standard way, and the weights remain unchanged in the traditional way of doing it. There's no new data from the world coming in. We can't ask how consistent is this with the world and adjust those assumptions because we have no observations from the world to go on between observations. But at the observations, we will actually make an observation and adjust the weights. Okay, I could go into this. But I think I'm going to skip this. Suffice it to say that this whole technique is based on something called importance sampling. Importance sampling is a technique that provides us with a way of sampling flexibly. We'd like to sample from one thing. Think, okay, you want to draw from a normal distribution. But suppose your programming language doesn't have a normal distribution. All it has is a uniform distribution. Well, it turns out you can still do it. You can still do it quite readily. What you do is you draw from a normal distribution. And the draw, you treat it as more significant, more plausible, more weighty. If it's at a point where the normal distribution compared with the value of the uniform distribution is high, you'll consider it with extra weight if it's a value that's very likely to occur under a normal distribution, or if this is a value from the uniform distribution that's very unlikely to occur under a normal distribution, you'll give it a low weight. So you can imagine a situation where you can't draw from a normal distribution. You can draw from a uniform distribution. Here we are. There's your uniform distribution, say between 0 and 10. And what you really want is you want a normal draw from a normal distribution, which looks something like this. Ignore this guy. The same range 0 to 10, but this normal distribution you can't draw from. There's no library to draw from. So you draw from this uniform distribution, and you ask for the value that I get. Maybe I get the value 7.31. And you ask, how likely is this to occur for a uniform distribution versus for a normal distribution? And if it's much more likely to occur for a normal distribution than a uniform, you'll count it with a higher weight. By contrast, if this is a value which you get from the uniform distribution, which is very unlikely to occur for a normal, we'll give it a very low weight. Count it as not not really a plausible sample. So we give it a low weight. And then to draw from the normal distribution, all you do is you draw from those weighted samples. You draw 10,000 of those weighted samples, associate each of them with a weight according to the relative likelihoods, according to this ratio between what you'd like to sample, the normal distribution, and what you can sample, the uniform distribution. And you draw from those 10,000 according to their weight, with a probability of each according to its weight. And that's something that's really easy to do, even with a uniform ability to sample from a uniform distribution. Okay, so that's the basic idea. Now, time is short, and I want to get to some high-level points here. So I'm going to go light on these points. You can find videos of me commenting on various points here. Those of you who have taken or will take the machine learning course or the AI course may have come across notions of prior and posterior. Have you heard those before? Prior and posterior? Okay, I see at least a few heads nodding. That's good. And really what's happening here is very similar to that. You have a prior distribution before each observation. It comes in, and you update that to a posterior distribution, take into account not just the prior, but the observation. Okay, it turns out to be central to the mathematics behind this. Now, in terms of how we actually undertake this, ladies and gentlemen, it turns out it's a very simple process to update the weights. At each observation, we update the weight of the particle. At time for following observation T, we updated it through the weight before that observation, weight that came about after the last observation, by multiplying it by the likelihood that we would observe this data that we see from the world. Maybe it's one data set, maybe it's 5 data sets, given the values of the states in the particle. So this is the particle that posits lots of people susceptible, almost no one exposed, almost no one infected, and just a few people recovered. And if our observations from the world say a bunch of people got infected with flu, we went to the emergency room, hundreds, and a few people died from flu, and lots of people were twittering about flu, or tweeting about flu online, and lots of people were searching. The likelihood of observing that in light of a particle's hypothesis that there's few people infected, few people exposed, is very small. So that likelihood would be very low, and we'd update the weight by multiplied by likelihood is very low, would make the weight very low. By contrast, if there was a particle which posited quite a few people infected and exposed, and postulated numbers of people coming in for care, similar to what we see, and searching online, similar to what we see, this weight would be quite high. We boost the weight and get a very large weight. Okay, so this is our way we adjust the weights. Time is short here, but suffice it to say there's some choices there as to how broad that likelihood function is, how accommodating we are for being off a little bit or via a lot expectation than what we see from the world. Okay, now when we're reasoning about this model, we may be interested in certain things, like we're interested in the mean estimated number of people. So for all the hypotheses there, what's their sort of average number of people they think right now that are infected, for example? And to do that, what we actually do is we draw from particles, number of people in the infected state, we draw the different particles, and but we draw each with a probability according to its weight. This is the whole important sampling idea. So something that has a big weight, we're much more likely to draw than something with a small weight. And we use those particles we draw to take the average over those. Okay, and so we might draw 1,000 particles and take the average. each one is drawn in a way that it's much more likely if to be drawn if it has a high weight than a low weight. It's proportional to the weight as its probability of being drawn. Okay. I'm not going to go into this, but suffice it to say that we can, with these frameworks that take into account data over time that have many hypotheses about the world, we can do a lot better than with calibration. Calibration is great. Calibration is a process of adjusting our parameters and assumptions in the model so that we can better learning about the model. Particle filtering, by allowing us to observe data as it comes in and updating not just our parameters, but our state, our understanding of how many people are in each of these states, is more powerful than particle filtering. Ladies and gentlemen, in particle filtering, we have a complete representation of the state of the system in each particle. So when we are weighting certain particles more highly, we're weighting our understanding of how many people are there in each stock. For example, in a stock and flow model, a system dynamics model. By contrast, in calibration, traditional calibration, we are purely updating parameters. We're not updating our state. We're not updating our understanding of what the current situation is. We're just updating our understanding of what the parameter values are. And so if we look at the discrepancy between what a particle filter model expects in the next week versus, say, what a calibrated model, calibrated to all the data until now, expects in the next week, a particle filter model will actually do much better. It'll do much better because it has a sense of where we are now in terms of number of people in each state, not merely a better sense of the parameter values. So here I've shown a sort of discrepancy for each, a little bit like the difference function that you folks are using in the final, in the problem 1 of the final problem set of assignment 3. Excuse me, assignment 4. And between the error associated with calibration 8,000 versus with particle filtering 1,047. As more data comes in, both become more accurate, but once magnitude difference for much of this range, 39,000 compared to 554, for example. Yeah. So turns out particle filtering is particularly powerful, and it's powerful compared to calibration. Now, this has been a whirlwind glimpse at a deep area. I don't expect you to remember all the details of the mathematics or anything like that. But I do want you to remember the basics that I've tried to emphasize. Ladies and gentlemen, particle filtering is a powerful method. It's a general method. It's a method for bringing together emerging data from the world on the one hand with a model's expectations on the other. To combine them together, you can get something where the whole is greater than the sum of the parts, where the model's understanding of the world can be regrounded in much the same way as when we're walking a Place Riel. If we take a peek with our eye every 15 seconds, we can get an understanding this is where I am, and with greater confidence, we can plan where do we need to go in the next few seconds. So particle filtering is more effective than calibration in general, and it's less labor intensive than calibration. Most importantly, we're regrounding the state of the model, the number of people in different states that are estimated to be in different states. Particle filtering, ladies and gentlemen, needs to balance too little confidence and too much confidence about the model predictions. It needs to balance how much confidence it has in the model predictions, how much confidence it has in the observations from the world. It can take into account many lines of evidence, not just one, not just 2, 3, 4, 5 different lines of evidence. It can take into account and create something which is kind of a consensus of them. Turns out that it's not magic. There's certain parameters you want to tune to have effective accuracy with the particle filtering. And this choice of a likelihood function, while I haven't emphasized it here, it's a very important important choice. Now, the use of methods like particle filtering is particularly important in light of a theme that I'll be highlighting next time. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a world that's increasingly characterized by what's sometimes known as big data. This is not a small feature of the current situation. It is overhyped. There's lots of people talking about it who don't know much about it. But it's an undeniable feature of the environment that you folks will be operating in your professional careers. And if you look at where companies are seeking to derive value, where you look at where decision makers in health and in countless other domains are seeking to, so I rebooted the whole stack.
Okay.
And
Flashing?
it was flashing, yeah. If you look at where decision makers are seeking to use to guide their decisions, increasingly it's based on data sources that are electronic and that are characterized by what Google calls the 4 V's. Mark my words, be relevant for next time too. Volume, lots of data, terabytes, petabytes of data. Some of my colleagues work at petabytes of data. Massive quantities of data. Data that you couldn't hope to store, in a MySQL data. Postgres will groan to accommodate the sorts of data you have. So lots of volume. That's actually the least interesting from many angles of the 4 V's of big data. The next of them, high velocity. It's coming in frequently. When I checked last February, there was something on the order of about 10,000 tweets a second generated worldwide. We accumulate here in Saskatchewan a record of Saskatchewan's tweets. We may have some from outside the borders, the nearby borders of the province, but it's about 1 million a month. Okay? They just pour in second after second after second. Think about the updates on Facebook occurring worldwide. Think about the types of data that are pouring in from lab tests, from imaging, pouring in from all sorts of sources, the number of people calling or weblogs, etc. These are massive amounts of data. So that's the second V, high velocity. A third V, high variety. So often from a same individual or the same area, the same region, we'll have lots of different data sources. We'll have Google searches that are occurring. Tens of thousands each second worldwide from a given area. We'll have from that same area the tweets. We'll have that same area maybe the call volumes to helplines. We'll have from that area information related to the numbers of people per 15-minute period going to the emergency room. All of this from the same area or from the same person. We do a lot of data collection with smartphones. And from the same smartphone, your smartphone is chock-a-block full of sensors. From the same smartphone, in the same 5-minute interval, we get accelerometer, where you are, GPS or location. We can get information related to your orientation, sitting, standing. Get information related to the proximity to others of interest or to objects of interest that are tagged. We do all of this through people who agree to it, who are willing to do this as part of their willingness. But the fact is that companies out there are not asking for permission. We only do it if someone wants to opt into a study. They do it on a regular basis using data streamed from your phone. And use it to flash you messages about what services are nearby, advertise, or what have you. Browsing data comes in, information from all sorts of sources. So variety, often from one person or one region, lots. And finally, veracity. Things that, we weren't very good at reporting, like levels of physical activity between Fitbits and data from phones. And so we get very good pictures of how much physical activity people are engaging in. These are aspects of big data that can allow us to make better decisions. Volume, velocity, variety, and veracity. And they mesh incredibly well with dynamic models. Dynamic models, by definition, consider the velocity part. They consider the dynamics of the situation. And these data can ground those models, because these data, like the models, are characterizing things over time. The types of methods we're talking about here, bringing in data as it arrives, are highly applicable to this sort of data we get through these big data sources, and can bring it together with models that depict theory about what's going on out there in the world, that will ground those models at levels that would have been inconceivable 10 years ago or 20 years ago. We have this opportunity to build models that are self-correcting, in the sense that the data sources update them with the current state of things. So even if a model omits a bunch of factors, it can be corrected as the current situation so that it can look forward with strong confidence, instead of just diverging from its expectations of the world. This is the promise of this world of big data, ladies and gentlemen, in models. And next time, we're going to see how even just one time series from the world in this can often whisper a tremendous amount about what's giving rise to it, what's generating it. It can tell you all sorts of things about the system that are giving rise to it in a way that can help us, amongst other things, detect what's driving what within the system, whether there's certain feedbacks in place, etc. In short, it illuminates for us the necessary structure of a model that we can use to characterize it. Okay, so that's for next time. I hold office hours now. I'd welcome people who want to talk about the assignment or other things. I would remind you once again, Thursday evening from 5 to 7, we're holding a review session, okay? And to the best of my knowledge, it has not yet been set. I believe it may be in this room, but I'll be sending the update to the class site. Thank you very much. Yeah.
We're gonna choose and that I choose the plan that I'm not gonna assignments and